History Inside a Nutshell, the show where we sail into our port of call discussing maritime history. Helen Smith, the Orphan of the Lusitania. The sinking of the Lusitania was one of the most tragic disasters in wartime history. It was an event that pushed the United States to join the war effort, as many American citizens had perished. Britain and most of Europe had already been at war with Germany for a year, and the disaster affected many British families, including children. One of these children was 6-year-old Helen Smith, who became the most photographed child following the sinking. Through her photos and with her story being shared with the world, she became a symbol of propaganda, using the photos as proof to blame the German Kaiser for murdering innocent people. She also became a celebrity, having 22 applications from people who wanted to adopt her, including the man who saved her life. However, her story is a tragic one, as the disaster changed her life, especially at a young age. Helen Smith was born in October 1908 in Swansea, Wales. 10 months after her birth, she and her parents, Elizabeth and Alfred Smith, moved to the United States, where they moved in with her uncle. During their time there, the family lived in New York and Pennsylvania. This was due to Alfred's job, as he worked as an electrician. In 1914, Helen's brother Hubert was born. In the same year, there was an outbreak, and within a year of the First World War, things were beginning to change in the Smith family. Having felt the guilt of not doing his part in the war effort, Alfred decided to make a contribution and enlist in the British Army. At this time, Elizabeth had become unhappy with life in America, and she wanted to return to Wales and be with her parents. This suited Alfred fine, and both agreed that the move would be the best for the children. With this agreement, Alfred and Elizabeth decided to sail home on the Lusitania. Why? The reason for this was because of a family connection with the Cunard line. In 1907, following the Lusitania's maiden voyage, an officer invited a member of Alfred's family, who was a well-known seaman, to have a tour around the ship. With this connection, it had been an obvious choice. Also joining the Smith family were Helen's aunt, Cecilia Owens, and her sons, Ronald and Reginald. The family, accompanied by Cecilia's husband, left Elwood City on the 29th of April before they boarded the Lusitania on the 1st of May in New York. Cecilia's husband saw them off before he returned to Elwood City. On board the Lusitania, the Smiths and the Owens travelled together as second-class passengers. On the 7th of May, the Lusitania was sailing in fog, and in that morning, the ship's captain made the fatal mistake of sounding the ship's horn and reducing the speed from 21 knots to 18 knots, and sometimes down to 15 knots. The fog lifted at 11 AM, and by lunchtime, they were sailing towards Old Kinsale Head. Lunch was served at 1 PM. After lunch had been served, the Smiths returned to their cabin, and Elizabeth insisted that Helen should change into travelling clothes. "Tomorrow morning we shall be landing in Liverpool," she told Helen. A little after that, Elizabeth and Alfred continued to pack, while Helen, Ronald and Reginald went up on deck to play. However, Cecilia had only allowed the boys to play until 2 in the afternoon. When it was 2, they left Helen all by herself. At 2:10 PM, the Lusitania was struck by the German submarine U-20. Following a direct hit, the ship listed heavily to starboard and was beginning to sink. Immediately, the passengers headed to the lifeboats, and the crew were hurrying to prepare the lifeboats. However, the crew proceeded to get the passengers in the boats in an orderly, prompt and efficient manner. In the rush, Helen noticed she couldn't find her parents. She ran down the deck towards a man who was Ernest Cowper. Ernest Cowper was a newspaperman who worked for a Toronto newspaper. He was on his way to Europe as he had been assigned to be a war correspondent. Cowper was reported, in his own words, to have witnessed the torpedo hitting the Lusitania. When she was sinking, a few women came rushing towards him. He asked a uniformed member of the crew when Cowper wasn't sure. The crew member answered, "All I know is that we should get ready to leave." When she saw him, Helen ran to Cowper pleading, "Please, mister, will you take me with you?" Straight away, Cowper picked Helen up and carried her to a corner of the second cabin promenade deck. Once they reached the corner, he said, "I'll be right back, then you can come with me." Cowper left Helen to run down 2 flights of stairs to look for lifeboats. She waited patiently for him until Cowper returned to her when he couldn't find them. When she saw him, Helen cried, "You came back to me, just like you said you would." They then went to find Helen's parents, but they were unsuccessful. The pair headed to the starboard deck before bringing Helen to lifeboat number 13. He handed her to another second-class passenger, Nellie Hampshire. He said to Hampshire, "She asked me to save her, says she couldn't find her mother or father, but her grandparents will be waiting for her in Liverpool." Then the officer in charge ordered Cowper to also get into the lifeboat, and Cowper did. Lifeboat number 13 was one of a few boats to be launched successfully and safely. When the boat touched the water, a crew member shouted to everyone to row for their lives before the suction of the ship swamped them. On Hampshire's lap, Helen said to her, "If I can't find my mama and daddy, I'll go with you, ladies." The Lusitania sank in 18 minutes. In total, 1,119 passengers and crew tragically perished. Helen and the rest of the occupants were rescued by the government boat, the Stormcock, and it was from there that they were taken to Queenstown. Once they were in Queenstown, Cowper and Helen searched for her family. They were unsuccessful in the dry dock. When they were inside the Queenstown Hotel, Cowper and Helen were overwhelmed by wealthy women who were willing to adopt her after they heard about their story. While inside, Helen spotted Cecilia from a distance, crying, "Why, here is Auntie!" When reunited, Cecilia told Helen that her parents, her brother, and her cousins died in the sinking. It was understood that Cecilia last saw Alfred and Elizabeth looking for Helen. When the Lusitania was hit by U-20, Cecilia was with Hubert. She met with Alfred and Elizabeth, and she recalled seeing Elizabeth running around frantically to find her daughter. Alfred, Elizabeth, and Hubert never made it to a lifeboat. Their bodies, along with the bodies of Ronald and Reginald, were never recovered. However, Helen didn't understand what Cecilia had told her. She believed that Alfred, Elizabeth, and Hubert made it onto another lifeboat. She waited in the hotel for them, but the realization kicked in, and soon Helen accepted the death of her family. The story of the Lusitania disaster made its way to the newspapers, but when the media learned about Helen's story, they took pictures of her and Cowper, which made their way into the US, UK, and Canadian newspapers. In response to this, 22 offers were made to adopt her. Cowper himself wanted to adopt Helen, but this never came to be. Helen received many letters, one from the Queen Consort, Queen Mary, and she even had a royal invitation from the Queen Dowager Alexandra of Denmark for a visit to Sandringham. But eventually, Helen was collected by her maternal uncles, who took her, alongside Cecilia, back home to Swansea. Once home, Helen would live and grow up with her grandparents, away from the limelight. In the aftermath of the sinking, Helen and Cowper kept in touch, and he would frequently send Helen presents at Easter and Christmas. They corresponded with each other until he died in 1939. Helen would live in Swansea for the rest of her life, and she acted as a mascot for the Girl Guides. But she would suffer from the aquaphobia and wouldn't go near any kind of water. In 1931, she married a wholesale department manager named John Henry Thomas, and they had a daughter together named Elizabeth, in memory of Helen's mother. She died on the 8th of April 1993, aged 84. When she lost her parents at a young age, Helen had to go through life without the two most important people. And although she had a book that published her story, she didn't tell people, as she had been taught to forget about the Lusitania disaster. One can imagine how difficult it was for her and the children who survived. Helen represents the trauma children went through during wartime. It's a chilling reminder of how war can destroy lives, physically and mentally. If you enjoyed this episode, please like and subscribe for future videos. Until next time, this has been History Inside a Nutshell, departing from the dogs. Thank you so much for all of your support, and enjoy the rest of your voyage.